March 1906. German uniforms in central London. The unsmiling men begin to disperse among the early morning shoppers. They'd arrived to bring fear to the very heart of Britannia's imperial capital. They were now goose-stepping down Oxford Street. No, this was not a real invasion, of course, which has been unaccountably missed out by the history books, but nor is it entirely television fantasy. It did happen, but it was a publicity stunt for the Daily Mail, who were serialising the latest thriller to shock the Edwardian British, the invasion of 1910. The German military threat was real enough, and Britain was being drawn into a ruinously expensive arms race. But a Liberal government had just been elected by a landslide, promising a welfare revolution. And Britain couldn't afford both. So which was it to be? Battleships or pensions? The underpinnings of warfare or of welfare? We are about to enter one of the most dangerous and exhilarating periods in the history of British politics, and our stage is set for a showdown. The Edwardian era is often remembered as a romantic, golden age. A long, hot summer of big hats, cottage gardens, and messing about on the river. A time of simple pleasures. Country house parties with picnics on the lawn. A lost Eden of innocence and imagination, immortalized in classic children's stories. The Railway Children, The Wind in the Willows, and Peter Pan. Now, it may be partly because of those children's stories, but Edwardian Britain has been covered by a golden, dappled glow, despite the facts, which are that this was a country tearing itself apart politically, economic and socially. Millions of real Edwardian children were barefoot and living on diets worse than the Middle Ages. The glitter was real. Fun was being had. But almost everywhere you look in Edwardian Britain, dark, angry storm clouds were brewing. On the 15th of July 1906, a young woman called Adela Pankhurst made her way to a park in Manchester called Boggart Hole Clough. She'd just been released from prison for heckling a local MP, Winston Churchill, at a public meeting. She was here to make a speech about that most basic right, the right to vote. Adela Pankhurst and her fellow speakers were standing here at the bottom of the hillside. A massive crowd spread out around them in all directions. As the meeting began, a group of thugs began mingling with the Pankhurst supporters. One of the speakers asked what the Tory cave dwellers and the medieval liberals were going to do about women's suffrage. The answer was a terrifying northern roar, and down the hill poured the men, many of them carrying sticks and coming straight for Adela. People in the crowd began to scream. and panic, the men went straight for the women, grabbed them, and brutally hauled them back up the hill, passing them from man to man. Their clothes were half torn off, they were beaten around the face until the blood flowed, and older men, respectable-looking men, started to shout obscene suggestions. The mood of the crowd turned until they were roaring like savages. What happened here one long ago Edwardian Sunday was only the very beginning, because the battle for democracy, women's votes, would prove to be extraordinarily violent. And this was only one of the increasingly violent arguments about poverty, privilege and liberty that provided the soundtrack for Edwardian Britain. But calming, progressive help was at hand. In January 1906, the Liberals were swept into power, promising to tackle inequality and reform politics. Their policies were exciting. Their Prime Minister wasn't. Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman had a radical streak, but looked and sounded like an elderly sea lion. Sir Henry once declared, "Personally, I am a great believer in bed, in constantly keeping horizontal. The heart and everything else goes slower, and the whole system is refreshed." Now, Sir Henry wasn't a well man, as well as being rather an idle one. Never mind, he did lead the Liberals to their greatest ever election victory, a new dawn after 10 years of Tory rule. And the new Liberal government contained 3 of modern Britain's great future Prime Ministers. Herbert Asquith was ridiculously clever, a self-made statesman whose sternly sober face hid a wildly romantic heart. Cartoonists called him the last of the Romans. Alongside him was Lloyd George, a charismatic Welsh radical, and his unlikely admirer, a young aristocrat and former Tory MP, Winston Churchill. 3 musketeers. They were ready to slash through the complacency of Westminster. But just at that moment, Campbell Bannerman's clever lying down in bed cure failed him. In April 1908, he became the first and only Prime Minister to die in Downing Street. Asquith took over. Now the reforms would really begin. A little later, alarmed by his exuberant drinking habits, colleagues would refer to the Prime Minister as Old Squiffy. But in 1908, Herbert Asquith was reshaping the administration into the greatest Liberal government of modern times. The Liberals came to power in an age of technological change. Careering motor cars, the telephone craze, talk of hydroelectric energy and wave power, and above all, the flying machine. A Frenchman, Louis Blériot, was the first man to fly across the Channel in July 1909. Britain wasn't quite an island anymore. Within 24 hours, his plane was on display at Selfridges in London, and a motorcar salesman called Claude Graham White was one of the thousands of visitors who came to gape. Well, Claude was hooked. And within 6 weeks, he'd been over to France, helped to build his own aircraft, and then when it was trundled out of the factory, no instruction, no training, he'd flown it successfully for at least 20 minutes, which meant that he was officially a magnificent man in a flying machine. The Daily Mail, always ready for a sharp stunt, offered a prize of £10,000, huge money, more than £750,000 today, to the first pilot to fly the 195 miles from London to Manchester, and the race of the year was filmed. Two men came forward, another Frenchman, Louis Paulhan, and our Claude. Things didn't start well for Claude. He went for an afternoon nap to prepare himself for the race the following day. Meanwhile, Paulhan, not even waiting for a test flight, had set off. By the time Graham White was woken up, he was already an hour behind, and he decided on a desperate measure. He would fly through the night. Now, he had no lights, no altimeter, no fuel gauge, no compass. This was enormously dangerous. He relied on the headlamps of friends' cars on the roads below. By 4 in the morning, his engine had failed and he had to put down. A huge crowd gathered and he was off again. Next time, he was forced down by winds to hear the dreadful news that it was too late. Paulhan had already arrived in Manchester and claimed the prize, thanks to such dastardly tactics as not having a sleep before he started. Meanwhile, swathes of deepest England were also sleeping. Compton Verney, near Stratford-upon-Avon, or would it? Soon after the Liberal landslide, a quizzical, long-faced aristocrat, the 19th Lord Willoughby de Brooke, was clip-clopping around his estate, reflecting on the joys of fox hunting. That morning, Willoughby de Brooke met an old farmer who told him that after the Liberal victory, nothing would be the same again. Everything that you have will be taken away from you and divided amongst the people. I didn't believe a single word of it, said the 19th Lord later. I carried on hunting as if nothing was going to happen. For Willoughby and his kind, the modern world was a most unpleasant rumour. But they were all about to get the shock of their titled little lives. From the day the Liberals came to power, a small army of gloriously old-fashioned Tory peers had been vetoing almost every attempt at reform. And in 1909, Asquith's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lloyd George, was about to ignite one of the greatest political battles of the age, whose result shapes our politics even now. David Lloyd George was the most radical chancellor this country had ever known. He was pledged to bring Britain into a new age of welfare, when wretchedness and human degradation will be as remote to the people of this country as the wolves which once infested its forests. But to the rich, Lloyd George himself was a great deal more dangerous than any wolf. In 1909, recession was looming, unemployment was rising, and with no state pensions or national insurance, Britain was still tormented by Victorian levels of poverty, sickness, and hunger. Lloyd George wanted to pay for welfare reforms by making massive cuts in defence spending. But with fears of a German invasion being stoked by the popular press, he had little room for manoeuvre. Out on the street, patriotic crowds were chanting for the latest awesome war machine, the British-built Dreadnought battleship. We want 8 and we won't wait. Lloyd George's problem was that dreadnoughts were ruinously expensive. To pay both for them and for welfare, he devised what he called his people's budget. He said it was a war budget to wage implacable warfare against poverty and squalidness. To pay for both dreadnoughts and welfare, Lloyd George announced an increase in estate duties, a huge blow to the wealthy. And he also introduced a new super tax for the super rich. The People's Budget was a direct hit on landowners in the Lords, many of them in Lloyd George's own party, and they still had huge power over the elected Commons. Lord Rosebery, an immensely wealthy landowner who'd also been Liberal Prime Minister, described the People's Budget as pure socialism, the negation of faith, of family, of property, of monarchy, of empire. In fact, he said, it wasn't really a budget at all. It was a revolution. And around Britain, the wealthy began the most ferocious campaign. In the newspapers, in the city, among landowners, and in the House of Lords. They even formed the Anti-Budget League. And so, on the evening of July the 30th, 1909, Lloyd George decided he had no choice but to take his People's Budget directly to the people. That night, 4,000 men crammed themselves into a former pub called the Edinburgh Castle in the East End of London. The Chancellor of the Exchequer stood up to raucous applause. Many who heard Lloyd George in his prime said he was the greatest orator British politics ever produced, and this was to be the speech of his life. Was it not a shame that a rich country like Britain should allow people who had toiled all their lives to die in penury and starvation? His People's Budget, he said, was being opposed by shabby rich men. He needed the money for dreadnoughts, he reminded the audience, and the workmen put in their coppers. But when he went round wealthy Belgravia, there arose such a howl. Well, I tell you, the day of their reckoning is at hand. This was bare-knuckle class warfare. Rumours were already spreading that some landowners were threatening to sack their servants if the People's Budget was passed. Lloyd George was merciless. Are they going to threaten to devastate rural England by feeding and dressing themselves? He asked. A typical nobleman needs one man to fix his collar and adjust his tie in the morning, a couple of men to carry a boiled egg to him for his breakfast, a fourth man to open the door for him, a fifth man to help him in and out of his carriage, a sixth and a seventh to drive him. Why, a fully equipped duke costs as much to keep up as 2 dreadnoughts. To his fervent admirers, Lloyd George was the Welsh wizard. He was the Merlin of radical politics. And on that night, he blew on the fire with all his magic dragon might and brought the trouble to boiling point. This was an age of public meetings and mass hysteria, live politics and live theatre. While Lloyd George was wowing them at the Edinburgh Castle, another rising star was doing the same in the West End. Music, or vaudeville, mattered in 1909. Films didn't. They were mostly novelties and curiosities. Like the aristocrats, music hall stars would surely be around forever. Not quite. One young Londoner would become the symbol of this next revolution. Charlie Chaplin grew up in Lambeth, South London, and his early life was as grim as anything you'll find in the novels of Dickens. His father deserted the family before drinking himself to an early grave. The Chaplins ran out of money and food, and they touched bottom here at the Lambeth Workhouse, a place built to be scary, designed to be humiliating. Desperately trying to help out the family finances, Chaplin tramped all over Britain as a child performer. He had a go at singing, clog dancing, and a disastrous attempt at stand-up comedy, before settling on slickly timed, gag-filled comedy sketches. In early 1908, he had his big break, a contract with the Fred Karno Company. Karno had been a famous acrobat and clown, credited with the invention of the custard pie in the face gag. Now he was head of the greatest comedy troupe in Britain, if not the world. Fred Karno's headquarters here in Camberwell in South London was known as the Fun Factory. It really was a kind of factory. He drove his performers very hard with frantic rehearsal schedules. And if he didn't like an act, he'd stand in the wings and blow raspberries at his own actors. Whenever he was asked, "Who's your star turn?" he'd reply, "My name's up there, and that's enough." Mr. Karno, and who's heard of him nowadays, had a cuckoo in the nest. In February 1908, Charlie Chaplin topped the Karno bill for the first time. And in the same year, a young comic called Arthur Stanley Jefferson joined the company. He's better known now as Stan Laurel. So for a couple of years, two of the greatest comic geniuses of cinema shared shabby digs and performed together all over Britain and the United States. In 1912, Chaplin was spotted by the emerging American film industry and offered a contract with the Keystone Company in Los Angeles. Chaplin had seen some of the Keystone films and he wasn't much impressed. He described them as crude, rough and tumble. But he took the money, it was a lot, and said ta-ra to the Karno troupe. Stan Laurel thought he was making a great mistake. "We all wished him well from the bottom of our hearts," he said later, while secretly congratulating ourselves on possessing a superior wisdom. Even Chaplin didn't really get the movies. "A year in that racket," he said, "and I could return to vaudeville, an international star." In his first movie, Making a Living, Chaplin played a hapless newspaper reporter. Drawing on his Karno training, he packed every scene of the 8-minute reel with improvised gags. Later, he sat down with great excitement to watch the edited version of his first performance on screen. And it broke his heart. Chaplin's first film performance had been improvising the next film. On his way to the wardrobe, Chaplin said, he decided to put on some baggy pants, big shoes, a cane, and a derby hat. Already gags and joke ideas were racing through his mind. And with the single addition of a small moustache, the tramp was born. By 1912, the British were flocking to the movies in their millions, and the boy from the Lambeth workhouse would go on to become the greatest film star of the age. Had he not taken that reckless gamble on the other side of the Atlantic, he'd have been stuck in the declining world of the music hall, and Charlie Chaplin would be a name known only to a tiny number of enthusiasts. Actually, more likely, given the streets he came from, he would have signed up early for the First World War and been killed. Throughout 1909, British fears about German military expansion grew and grew. Balanced defence and welfare was still being blocked by the House of Lords. In November 1909, by a huge majority, they finally kicked it out. The first time the Lords had ever rejected a budget. It was an act of suicidal stupidity. and it was Asquith's chance to clip the old buzzard's wings. Under the British system, the Lords would only lose those powers by voting themselves, a kind of political self-slaughter. Not very likely. And so Asquith asked the king to allow the creation of 400 to 500 new liberal peers. Democracy would swamp aristocracy. Edward VII hated the idea. The man was, after all, a king-emperor. And so to try and delay things, he said to Asquith there'd have to be another special general election first. This concession did not reassure the landed aristocrats. In this chamber, behind gnarled hands where blue blood still flowed, they started to call the king himself a traitor. 1910 would be a year of political turmoil. There would be 2 general elections. The first to break the deadlock on the people's budget. The second to decide the fate of the House of Lords. The Liberals hung on to power with the backing of 40 Labour MPs and 82 Irish nationalists. The people's budget was finally passed. Asquith now turned his attention to the House of Lords. His reform bill to cut away their powers of veto wouldn't mean the total abolition of the upper house. But it did mean that the domination of the House of Commons over this place would be near absolute. In May, worried old King Edward died. Would be the Liberals' next target. Feeling bullied and with great reluctance,